My name's Sarah Firman, and I'm a specialist dietitian working in the Adult Inherited Metabolic Disease Service at Guy's and St Thomas's, based in London. And today I'm going to be talking about the nutrition and dietary management of Familial Chylomicronaemia Syndrome. In our service, we look after adults with FCS from the age of 16 and over. So the experience I'm going to be sharing today is focused on that group, 16 years and above. But hopefully a lot that I'll speak about will also be relevant to other areas. Just briefly, my disclosures. Thank you to Sobi for having me to speak at this event. So the next half an hour or so is going to be very much focused on providing an overview of the dietary recommendations for Familial Chylomicronaemia Syndrome. I will also be touching on some important nutrients to consider when on a diet for FCS, talking about portion sizes and how a plate may look when thinking about the different food groups, providing some tips on a low-fat diet, some of the tips that we've had from patients in our service around cooking, baking, and adding flavour, a little bit of information around things to think about when eating out, and then finally monitoring. So how much fat am I having each day? So the overarching key or core recommendation of the dietary management for Familial Chylomicronaemia Syndrome is the very low fat diet. And you may have heard less than 10 grams, less than 20 grams, but in our service and what we do generally recommend is that this very low fat diet is individually tailored. So it's a recommendation that should be based on someone's individual triglyceride levels. And that's because the goal of the very low fat diet is to bring triglyceride levels down to ideally less than 10 millimoles per litre or 885 milligrams per deciliter. And that is the level that has been shown to reduce the risk of acute pancreatitis. However, achieving this level can be incredibly challenging, even with following a very low fat diet. So whilst we ideally recommend triglyceride levels to be below 10, below 20 is acceptable. So the low-fat diet is what forms the basis for the FCS diet, and we're going to explore a bit more about this today. So I work in inherited metabolic diseases with lots of different conditions, some that have to be limiting protein, some that limit carbohydrates, and some that limit fats. And what I always like to think about with the different conditions is when you are limiting one of these macronutrients, what is the role of that macronutrient? And by limiting it, what is the potential challenges that someone could experience in that diet? So for FCS, the key component is fat. And firstly, thinking of what the role fat does and fat provides to the diet, just in general, fat gives essential fatty acids. They provide a source of fat-soluble vitamins, and fat has a really important role in satiety, so feeling full. And also, they are the macronutrient that provides the most calories. So with FCS and needing to limit fats, there is the potential challenges that can occur, such as not getting enough essential fatty acids, which we're going to talk a bit more about today, not getting enough fat-soluble vitamins, struggling with feeling full or satisfied, which can lead to cravings, and for some might lead to changes in weight, or the opposite, which is struggling to get enough calories, which for children or growing adolescents could affect growth, and for adults may also affect the ability to keep weight stable. And all these points we're going to touch on today. Starting first with essential fatty acids, you may have heard of omega-3 and omega-6. So these are the two essential fatty acids, and the reason they're called essential is that the body can't make these fats, so they have to come from the diet. These essential fatty acids normally come from foods such as vegetable oils, nuts, seeds, oily fish, chicken, whole grains, green leafy vegetables. Some of these foods may be part of a very low-fat diet, but a lot of these foods would be very, very limited or completely avoided in an FCS diet. So intake of these foods will very much depend on someone's fat restriction. If someone is needing to limit fat to less than 10 grams, that may be really tricky to get those sources in the diet. versus maybe someone that triglycerides are managed on 20 or 25 grams of fat. So it really will depend on the amount of fat and also the food choices. But they are essential, and they have an important role in all the cells of our body. They're important in eyes and the brain. And these essential fatty acids, omega-3 and omega-6, convert down to longer chain fats, which also have a really important role. And these are things such as, you might have heard the word DHA or arachidonic acid. So it's important to ensure that when following a low-fat diet or a very low-fat diet, that you are getting enough essential fatty acids. So speaking with your health professional or dietitian about this is really important. Some centres are able to monitor essential fatty acids, and that's another discussion that's worth having to see if you are able to get these tested to check that your levels are okay. The other aspect is fat-soluble vitamins. So fat-soluble vitamins are vitamin A, D, E, and K, and they have a really important role, again, in eyes, in the skin, hair, in immune function, antioxidants, in bone health. So they're an incredibly important part of the diet. Fat-soluble vitamins are normally found in foods that are high in fat. So on a FCS, very low-fat diet, these are foods that will generally be limited. And they also need fats to absorb. So there's two factors here to consider. For that reason, fat-soluble vitamins are really important to monitor, and most centres will be able to monitor fat-soluble vitamins. In our service, we do recommend taking a daily supplement that contains fat-soluble vitamins, so not necessarily taking high doses of any of these by themselves, but taking a general A to Z multivitamin that does provide daily needs of A, D, E, and K. Vitamin D is one that doesn't come from the diet. So vitamin D comes from the sunshine. So depending on where you live in the world, you may get a bit more vitamin D than others, but it is another really important one to monitor and make sure that you're getting enough supplemented or through the diet. So again, talking to your doctor or dietitian is recommended. So we've talked briefly about the components of fat and the nutrients that fat provides, but I am going to now talk about some of the other important macronutrients that have a role in the diet. Protein has a really important role in addressing the issue of satiety and fullness when you're on a very low fat diet. So with needing to restrict fat down for FCS, it can sometimes feel that you aren't always satisfied with a meal, and so protein is incredibly important. They are the next macronutrient that can provide that full feeling or that satiating feeling. Proteins also have a really important role in growth and development for children and adolescents, and also for adults in maintaining muscle mass and lots of other parts of the body, strength and immune function too, and also are an important source of calories. However, proteins themselves can be very high in fat, and so it's important to select proteins that are low fat or lean protein options. And I've included on the slide just a few options, and there's also some in the picture. So examples of low fat or lean proteins that would be good to include in the diet are things such as turkey or chicken breast, very lean cuts of meat. For example, goat can be quite a lean option. Egg whites are a good option. So with an egg, all the fat is in the yolk. So by removing the yolk and using egg whites, you're getting benefit of the protein without the fat. Tin tuna, that's tin tuna that would be in spring water. So definitely avoiding the ones that are in oil. Prawns, legumes, and then you've got the dairy-free, the fat-free dairy options, which also provide a really good source of protein. So with needing to restrict fat in the diet, protein does serve as a really important macronutrient on the plate, and we would recommend including protein at every meal. The guide is to have at least a third of a plate, or if you're looking at your hand, about a hand-sized serve of protein. So that might be a chicken breast or a fillet of white fish or a portion of legumes that fits into a cupped hand size. So thinking about proteins that you enjoy and can incorporate as part of your day is really important. The next important part of the diet is the role of carbohydrates. And I've got some examples of carbohydrates on the slide there. So things such as potato or pasta, and we will talk a bit more about some options. They also have a really important role in providing a feeling of fullness. They're a really good source of fiber, calories, and also carbohydrates are the main source of fuel for the brain. So they break down into glucose or sugars in the body, which is the fuel that the brain can use function and is important as a main energy source for the body. So the recommendation for FCS when it comes to carbohydrates is to have complex carbohydrates and to limit added sugar. So what does this mean? Refined carbohydrates are carbohydrates that are really processed, that the fibrous part of the carbohydrate has been broken down. So for example, white bread, white rice, your sort of standard pastas that you might see, they're the more refined carbohydrates. And then we have the complex carbohydrates, which are the carbohydrates that are recommended in FCS. And they would be things such as the wholemeal bread, brown rice, wholemeal pasta, oats, wholemeal cereals and grains. But it is a bit of a balancing act because with FCS, when you are needing to limit the fat down to such a restrictive amount, a lot of the more complex carbohydrates are naturally higher in fat than the more refined carbohydrates. So it is about a balance and working with your team to see how you can incorporate these more complex carbohydrates into your day within the fat allowance. And after this slide, I'm going to talk about a case where we had to balance out the fat and the carbohydrates as well. You may need to also consider foods that are naturally high in sugar. So added sugar is something that needs to be limited, but some foods are also naturally high in sugar. So these things might be fruits or fruit juices, and these can still be included as part of the day, but it's just thinking about portion size and frequency. So aiming more to have 2 serves of these a day and spaced out over the day would be recommended. Carbohydrates also provide an important source of calories, so it is recommended to include these at each meal. So here we have a case study to provide an example of the fat and the carbohydrate balance. I have had permission from this person to share this case. So this was a patient under our service who had FCS, specifically lipoprotein lipase deficiency. And they came to our service as an adult, and at their first review, their triglycerides were 25 millimoles per litre, or over 2,000 milligrams per deciliter. And at initial review, their fat intake was 38 grams a day. Blood showed that fat-soluble vitamins were within range, and a diet analysis did show that omega-3, so the essential fatty acid, was low. So based on these triglycerides and the diet assessment that we made, we discussed with the patient about reducing fat down to 20 grams a day. So that was about 10 grams of total calories coming from fat, and to start an essential fatty acid supplement. And a reanalysis or reassessment of the diet a few weeks later showed that they had reduced their fat intake down to 16 grams a day. At the next clinic review, 6 months later, the repeat triglycerides had reduced down to 18, which was about 1,500 milligrams per deciliter. And review of food diary at that time had showed that, in fact, they had reduced their average fat intake down to 14 grams a day, so much lower than the recommendation we'd given of 20 grams. But because of reducing their fat so much, they had needed to increase a lot of sugars and carbohydrates to get enough calories over the day. So they were having a really high intake of free sugars that were added into foods, sweets, or very sugary cereals, for example. So at that time, we talked about the importance of complex carbohydrates. And when it comes to complex carbohydrates, if they are very sugary and there's a big rise in glucose, that can cause triglyceride levels to increase. So that is why with carbohydrates, we're trying to get the balance between fats and carbohydrates. So we talked about the recommendation of changing from some of the more simple, refined, high sugar carbohydrates to more complex carbohydrates to help reduce the sugar. But by doing that, that would mean that food choices were a little bit higher in fat. So for example, going from white bread to wholemeal bread was going to add a few grams of fat. And so to allow for that change in carbohydrates, we really encourage this person to increase their fats back up to the restriction of 20 grams a day. And at the next follow-up appointments, they've done a fantastic job with bringing that sugar down, adding in some more complex carbohydrate food choices, and keeping their fat restriction around 20 grams a day. And their triglycerides on repeat at clinic were 13, and a few months later were 12. So this was a really nice example of where both of those aspects can be important when thinking about the food that's on your plate and the different food choices. Some carbohydrates, I've just included a few. There are many, many foods classified as carbohydrates, but here are some examples, such as potato, brown rice, white rice, which we've talked about, couscous, bulgur wheat, pasta, oats, wheat pix, just to name a few, but there's many out there. And as they say, it plays such an important role in providing calories, in fiber, and helping with satiety. We recommend that at least a third of the plate comes from carbohydrates, or around about a fifth serve, but it does depend. Some fifths can be a bit smaller than others, but that's a good guide as a starting point for carbohydrate. Too much, so if you were having it half the plate or more, that can impact on triglyceride levels. So it is getting that carbohydrate around a third of a plate or a fifth size serve. So when we think of the different components in the diet that I've talked about, so fat, protein, and carbohydrate, for the general population, they would be getting around 35% of calories from fat, which would be about 70 to 90 grams of fat a day. The rest of the diet comes from protein and carbohydrates, with about 15% of calories coming from protein and about half of calories coming from carbohydrates. When we think about the very low fat diet, fats are really needing to be reduced down to about 10% of calorie requirements, which it depends again on the individual. It is an individualized recommendation based on triglycerides, but that can be around 20 to maybe 28 grams of fat a day. So with needing to keep fat down so restricted, protein and carbohydrates play such an important role. So about 30% of calories should be coming from proteins, and that's why getting a lean source of protein at every meal is very much recommended. And then carbohydrates will also make up a big portion of the calories in the day. However, the recommendation is not to have more than 60% of calories coming from carbohydrates. So that's where aiming for about a third of a plate at each meal would help to get that balance. Any more than that can mean that carbohydrates can start to have an effect on triglyceride levels. Another aspect of the diet that is important to talk about when it comes to FCS is the role of medium chain triglycerides. So medium chain triglycerides are fats that bypass the chylomicron dependent pathway. So they're absorbed differently in the body and they don't impact on triglyceride levels. So they can provide a really important source of calories if someone's needing support with growth or with weight maintenance. And they can be useful when trying to reduce their carbohydrates. If we think about the portions that were on the last slide, if someone's really struggling to be able to cut that carbohydrate down, they're still needing calorie source from somewhere, but they can't really increase fats or proteins much further. MCT or medium chain triglycerides can provide a really important source. Medium chain triglycerides it is important that they are medical grade MCT oil or MCT powders. So there are a lot of MCT oils that can be available online or over the counter, and sometimes these aren't always regulated, so they can contain some of the longer chain fats that will impact on triglycerides. So it's important when getting a source that they are medical grade and prescription only is what we advise. A lot of the time you might hear that coconut oil is a medium chain triglyceride, and it is true that majority of coconut oil is medium chain. But when looking at coconut oil in its normal form, it does still contain some long chain fats, and so that isn't recommended to take with FCS. The medical grade MCTs are based off coconut oil or palm oil, but they've been refined to remove those longer chains, so they just contain the medium chain triglycerides. For those who have used MCT before, you might know that it can sometimes cause stomach problems for some people, so it is important to increase gradually if you are starting on it. And medium chain triglycerides, when cooked with, do have a low smoke point. So they're not very good for frying or for hot cooking, but can be added towards the end of cooking or after a food has been cooked, or to cold meals. So speak to your health professional or dietitian if you feel that this is something that would be useful as part of the FCS diet. So we've talked about the two aspects on the plate, and just going back to the plate, we've got a third of protein, third of carbohydrates. So what is the last portion of the plate? The last portion is the important role of vegetables. Vegetables provide lots of vitamins and minerals. For anyone, these are an important part of the diet, and majority of vegetables are low in fat. There's just a couple that are to be aware of, such as olives or avocados, nuts and seeds, and also some vegetables that are prepared or kept in oil will obviously have a very high fat content. But fresh vegetables are generally low in fat. They're a great source of fiber, and they can also help with that feeling of full. So we recommend vegetables take up at least a third of a plate to provide a good source of vitamins, minerals, and fiber. And lastly, the fruit is also an important component. So fruit should still be part of the day. We recommend keeping fruit to 2 serves a day and aiming for a serve being around about a fifth portion as your guide. And lastly, on the dietary recommendations, with FCS, we do recommend to go alcohol-free. So alcohol itself will increase triglyceride levels. And so we recommend looking at using alcohol alternatives. And over the last few years, there has been quite a lot of movement towards alcohol-free spirits, alcohol-free wines. And so using those so that you can still enjoy a drink and when you're out and about and socialize is really important. And then finally, regular exercise. And this recommendation is not specific to FCS. This is for anyone in the population. Exercise is important for overall health, but also for mood and mind. And so aiming for 150 minutes per week is part of our recommendation. This might be formalized exercise if you're someone that likes to have a routine and dedicated time to exercise, but it might also be fitting it into your everyday, such as stopping one bus stop earlier, walking to work, taking the stairs, just seeing how you can fit a bit of movement into the day. So in summary, the overarching core recommendation for the diet for familial chylomicronemia syndrome is a very low-fat diet, but it does vary from person to person. It's all the diets are classified as very low-fat, but whether you're on 10 grams, 20 grams, 15, that really should be guided by your triglyceride levels. It's important to ensure adequate essential fatty acids and fat-soluble vitamins, getting a lean or low-fat protein source at each meal, looking at how you can include some of those complex carbohydrates into each meal is important. And maybe it might not be possible for all carbohydrates to be complex, but maybe aiming to initially work towards half, using more whole grains or wholemeal varieties. MCT oil or powders can be used, and the recommendation to go alcohol-free. So that's the summary of the dietary recommendations. In terms of putting those into practice and into everyday life, being based in the UK, some of the websites we recommend is Action FCS and also the Heart UK. They both have a great selection of recipes around very low-fat cooking, and people can also go and share their recipes. So these are fantastic resources, and I'm sure across the world, different patient charities, patient advisory groups will have similar setups where you can share recipes and ideas. I've just got on the slide here the recommendation for Heart UK. So they do have an FCS specific website or page that has very low fat recipes. You can also search low fat recipes online, but my one caution would just be to make sure that they are low in total fat. So sometimes a recipe might say low in saturated fat, which is one type of fat, but it might still contain some of the other unsaturated fats, such as avocados, nuts, seeds, and those two are for FCS counted in total fat and need to be limited. So it's important that actually the recipe is low in all types of fat, not just saturated fats. A few tips on cooking without fat. A lot of these have come from the adults under our service who have FCS. So definitely worth investing in a non-stick pan and pots. That helps with cooking when you have to limit fats and oils. Instead of using oil, you can use small amounts of vegetable stock or vinegars, lemon juice, small amounts of soy sauce. These are really helpful for adding flavor, but also if you cook for a long time with these and let it caramelize down, they can help add color and caramelization to foods that maybe oil would normally do. Looking at different ways of cooking can help to create different textures in food. So looking at steaming or poaching or using a clean griddle pan to cook foods. And looking at using how you can use MCT in cooking. So as mentioned, it does have a low smoke point, but it can be used towards the end of cooking or for slow cooking at a lower heat in replace of standard oil. When it comes to baking, to not need to use grease, it can be helpful to use baking paper or try silicone cookware. Can be really useful. You can just pop out the cupcakes or the loaf and not needing to use any oils or fats. Oils and fats can be substituted with mashed potato or apple sauce. There's a lot of recipes online for this or on the website that I recommended earlier. And MCT oil can again be used in low heat cooking or if you're doing raw baking that doesn't need any heat. Herbs and spices are all low in fat, so you can use any variety of these when it comes to cooking to add flavor and a bit of variety to the meals. So trying different fresh and dried herbs, spices, spice mix. You can use lots of garlic, onion, chilies, lemon juice, lime juice, soy sauce, miso paste. You don't need a lot of these. They pack a good flavor, but just to create a bit more variety in the different meals that you're cooking in the week. And eating out, this can be incredibly challenging, as I'm sure you know. FCS is a rare condition, and so sometimes people's understanding of what it is and the fact that you actually do need the food to be low fat, it's not just a dietary preference, it's actually for your condition, can be really challenging and can be quite frustrating if people don't actually listen and understand. But it shouldn't stop you from eating out. It's important to go out and socialize. And so some of the recommendations that we talk about, and these are also recommendations that can be found in even further detail on some of the patient advisory or charity websites such as Action FCS, is to look at the menu online. A lot of restaurants now publish menus online, so looking in advance to see what suitable options might be available, calling the restaurant ahead of time if you have a special event on there, and just discussing with them, discussing with the chef what is the low fat options and what can they cater for you. And if needed, if it is the case, can you bring your own meal if you are wanting to participate in a social event, which is always very important to be able to do, but maybe the restaurant hasn't quite got the facilities to cater for a very low fat diet. And don't feel you can't ask how the meal is prepared. You definitely can. If you're out, you can talk with the chef, you can talk with the staff about how the meal's prepared and also what's been added, what ingredients, are there any oils, butters and sauces. Looking at switching your side dish for another option is recommended, so such as replacing, if there was fries is quite a common side option, replacing that with steamed vegetables or a salad. And when thinking of different cuisines, Japanese and Vietnamese can be a good place to start. They're generally, not all dishes, but a lot of dishes can be very low fat and very low fat options. So that can be a good place to start looking at menus and whether they can cater for you if you were eating out. And then very briefly, where to start when you go shopping. I could talk for a long time about this. This is a minefield. It's complicated. There's hundreds of foods when you go to the supermarket, all with different packages and labels, and so it can be quite quite a challenge to navigate which options to pick. Your reading food labels is a very important part of working out how much fat is in a product. There is a lot of great resources online under Action FCS, for example, that gives a nice overview of foods that are generally to be avoided and ones that are recommended. But if a food in front of you has a package and a food label, that can be incredibly helpful to understand more about what you're having in terms of fat. So legally, fat, all manufacturers have to put fat on a label, and they will always have the fat per 100 grams. They may sometimes have the fat per serve, but not always. So when looking at a product, you can look at the fat and per 100 grams to understand if you picked up two products that were similar. For example, biscuit packages I've got here, you could compare the two fats per 100 grams of a like-for-like product and see that the one at the top with 7.7 grams of fat per 100 grams is going to be definitely a better option than the one with 22.9 grams below. This label also has information per biscuit, so that is helpful if you're wanting to see if I have one item of this particular food, how much fat am I going to get? As mentioned earlier about the sugars and the carbohydrates, sugars can be another part to look at on a label. And if you have navigated the fats and found maybe two products that are like for like in terms of fat and you're working out which one to go for, looking at the next part to see how much sugar per 100 grams in that product can help to make a choice that would be lower in fat and the lower in sugar option as well. So these are incredibly helpful guide when you go out and about. I wish we had more time to talk about this, but do reach out to your dietitian or online. There can be a lot of great resources about how to read food labels. And as mentioned, if a food doesn't have a food label, looking at getting resources from the patient support groups or from your dietitian can be a really good place to start. And then monitoring fat intake. So with having a fat allowance and based on the triglycerides, you might be advised a set amount of grams that you're aiming for each day. And so keeping track of this can be really important, especially when we have 3 main meals a day and a few snacks. Knowing where those fats are going to come from and spacing it out over the day is really important. Some people like to keep a diary, writing it all down. Others like to use mobile phone apps. So there's lots of different apps out there that aren't necessarily for FCS, but where you can track and record your foods over the day, and helps to add up and count how much fat you're having. Bulk cooking can be a really helpful thing to do in terms of being able to plan in advance for meals. So as you'll know with FCS, it's really tricky to grab a very low fat meal on the go or a convenience meal. And so spending a few hours to do a bulk cooking of a low fat meal and separating it out for lunches and dinners can mean that you've got food that's easy to grab, whether you're at work or running late one evening, you've got a meal ready for you at home. So those are some of the things that can be helpful in terms of monitoring how much fat you're having over the day. And lastly, before we wrap up, with any very restrictive diet, and this diet is very restrictive, emotions and food definitely go hand in hand. So living with a restriction where you have to think about everything that goes into your mouth can be incredibly challenging. And it can mean that sometimes you have good days and bad days, and that's okay. So try not to be hard on yourself. I think one of the things that can really happen with any restrictive diet is that we have days where things are on track and days where things are a little bit harder. And sometimes you can create that cycle of guilt where you may not have had the day that's quite within your fat restriction, and then feeling guilty, and then emotional eating, and the cycle can continue and you can feel very down about the situation. So trying to break that cycle, accepting that there will be days that are good and there will be days that will be harder and maybe not quite on point, and that's okay. So reaching out to your social supports, whether they're friends, family, your health professional, to talk through those days and be able to start the next day back on track can be helpful. Try to focus on what you can eat rather than what you can't eat. I know there's a lot of foods that do contain fat that need to be restrictive, but there are, as we've hopefully talked through today, a lot of protein options, thinking about what can I have on my plate? What are my low protein food sources? What are my complex carbohydrate food sources? What are my vegetables that I can have to really fill up my plate and make it as colourful and have as much variety as possible is important. Cravings can be really tricky, and especially with being on the low-fat diet, if you aren't getting enough protein, feeling satisfied with meals can be an issue. So make sure that you've got some treats or things that you that are still within the low-fat boundaries that are easy to grab in your handbag, in your backpack, at work, at home, so that if you're having a busy day and you've got a craving, there are some options around that are easy to grab. And lastly, in terms of dietary guidelines and what I've spoken to about today, going through the different recommendations for dietary management of FCS, a guideline was published in the States in 2018, which has provided a lot of guidance on the dietary management. In the UK, we are very soon to publish the recommendations from dietitians around the UK in terms of supporting adults with familial chylomicronaemia syndrome. But I would also recommend to encourage your healthcare professional to link in with some of the specialist centres that are also providing support and management of adults or children with FCS, because sharing knowledge and experience is so important with these rare conditions, so that we can continue to grow our knowledge and our information around managing this condition. And for further information, I would recommend reaching out to your patient's advisory support groups. I've mentioned Action FCS and Heart UK because there are resources that we use being based in the UK, and I feel that they've got a lot of good information on there. And also some of the companies such as Sobi can have information to share around the condition and the management. And that takes me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions and answers. Thank you.